Hey, it's Steven Lerner in the PhocusWire Studio. Joining us today is Chetan Kapoor, co-founder of VDEC and research analyst for Phocuswright, and Mike Coletta, manager research and innovation for Phocuswright. They are both the co-authors of the State of Travel Startups report series. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Lots of trends going on in travel startups. When you look at your report, I believe it's 55% year over year increase in funding for travel startups. Why the big explosion?
Well, most of it is late stage funding. It's interesting. Chetan and I, every year, we look at the numbers and funding just goes up and up and up every year. And last year was by far the biggest year for travel startup funding in a decade, right? Since the recession. About 6 billion raised. I think it was 3.7 billion the previous year. So, investors are pouring money into later stage companies as valuations are escalating, and they're pursuing those opportunities. And we've actually seen, a little bit of a squeeze on the earlier stage side. We measure the number of funding rounds happening, and those are declining in recent years. So, I don't know, with the whole WeWork and SoftBank thing where, money was flowing so freely, it'll be really interesting to see next year if it's the first year in probably 10 years where funding starts to decline, and I think that might be true.
And to add to that, what's also happening is investors are pouring in larger capital into fewer set of companies, and that's creating a sort of uneven landscape between, let's say, the most funded companies who now have the ammunition to spread across the world, scale up aggressively compared to some of the underinvested or not so invested counterparts as well.
The pursuit to fuel the brands that are winning in their categories, especially the emerging categories, and try to build global platforms that can win the market.
Well, you mentioned that some of the companies are getting a bigger share of it. Are there any particular outliers in terms of companies that you see that are standing out?
Yeah, of course. There's Oyo, which came out of the blue last year in terms of high funding. Historically, we've seen Airbnb being an outlier. Historically, when we also track the ride-hailing category, the likes of Uber, Didi, Grab, Gojek, all of them have been outliers, and these are individual companies that really skew the entire category as well. And even in the case of private accommodation, this year we saw Oyo acquire Athleisure Group, so that will inflate funding to that said category as well, and show certain mismatch in terms of where the funding was going into how many companies and the average funding.
Private accommodation, I think, is one of the most exciting spaces for sure. There's so much happening there. On the consumer side, you have brands like Sonder and Lyric raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Vacasa has now raised 500 million. And even on the B2B side, Guesty and other revenue managers and channel managers raising tens of millions and maybe more coming soon. And now there's so much happening there. I think we're going to see more funding to come and then a lot of consolidation. So that's space I'm watching most closely.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think B2B is a very fascinating area. Case in point, private accommodation. It's not just about the B2B companies going out there and digitizing that content to on board to their partners, but it's also a spectrum of services around that said non-hotel accommodation, everything from housekeeping to guest transfers, utility payments, local tax measures. There's a whole string of property managers who are plugging in these services to create their moat. And then when they go further to their B2C partners and just onboard their content, it's in effect for a better customer experience. You're seeing something similar happening on the tours and activities side as well. A lot of fragmentation. There needs to be someone out there who's digitizing the content to make lives easier for a whole lot of B2C players too.
So you're seeing a lot of growth in certain verticals. On a regional level, is there anything that stands out?
APAC, I think hands down, it's been a winner in terms of travel startup funding for the last several years. And that's primarily because of the growing internet penetration in that country, in those regions, and the ability for customers to access different products now through their smartphones, and that's really fostering innovation in that part of the world.
And where for 10 years, most of the funding was coming from companies in the US. Last year, it was 8 or 9 companies were outside the US in terms
Yep.
of the top 10 we looked at
Yep.
funded companies. And were based mostly in APAC
China.
and Europe,
Yeah.
and very often in China. Sure.
Yeah.
So a lot more global funding than usual, I suppose.
Yeah.
Are there any active investors who stand out in the past year?
The most active, might be plug and play in that they
Yeah.
play in the earlier stages and they just make more investments.
Yeah.
Seem to be doing a great job there of
And
connecting startups with partners and building an ecosystem.
True.
I know you mentioned certain verticals, in particular private accommodations. Why the big uptick in the past year, especially for funding?
I think it has to do with two things. On one side, private accommodation has always been around. It has been a relatively undertapped online travel segment, and now with the category becoming mainstream, and investors see value in the margins as well. So compared to air, where margins are next to nothing, cruise is a big segment, but a pretty niche as well, where margins are high, but your target audience is relatively low. Private accommodation can cut across geographies, and the margins are pretty good, especially because for the first time in so many years, the internet is enabling global distribution of a property, let's say, even in Cape Cod, in Tuscany. And I think that's a big shift. It was 10 years ago what was happening in the case of hotels when Expedias and Booking and hotels brought that value proposition. So that's what's happening right
And the
now.
consumer demand is definitely there.
Yep. Yep.
Travelers are asking for this
Absolutely.
product, and there's a lot of different ways to deliver it, from the purpose-built companies like Sonder to
Yep.
managing professional properties to rental by owner. So it's just a really attractive space right now.
Yeah, a lot of money is being poured into it. So
Yeah.
this was 2019, 2020. We're almost there. What do you expect? Do you expect more of these trends to continue? What do you think might happen in the next year?
Like I said, I think funding, we might see an overall decline, and I kind of hope to see a little bit of that come back into the early stages. Something I've talked about a lot, though, at the earlier stages, which is great, is that last year I wrote a piece about the incubators and accelerators in the industry, and I tracked 90 of them, and there were pretty much zero 10 years ago. So that's something that ecosystem has blossomed so much, and is a real boon for early stage companies.
No, and I think to complement Mike's point, we've heard a lot about everybody in there talk about the seamless trip, the interconnected trip, and I think a whole lot of the pieces of the puzzle will come from these early stage companies who are tackling these problems or in a pretty novel way. You can have a one-stop shop, but the beauty in integrating these puzzles together is probably going to come from outside of the industry, because historically cross-selling has been an issue in this industry. So to say that a big brand out there is on top of its game would not be fair. I think these small pieces of the puzzle is what's going to glue them together. So I think that's going to be a big trend going forward.
So finally, in addition to the report, you also have the startup database.
Yep.
And then, of course, you have the summit here at the Phocuswright Conference. So I guess it all kind of ties into each other, doesn't it? All the trends and everything.
Yeah, the database is something that I'm not even sure who started. Was it you?
There was
ago.
one person before me.
Tracking travel startups for a long time now, I think close to a decade, pretty much manually. But last year, we started the process of putting that into a proper database. And this year, we're actually able to make that live for our clients. So we're really excited about that. It's kind of like Crunchbase for travel, but we meticulously spend a lot of time putting the companies into travel industry proper categories. So you can really look at air and hotel and car and even meta search and multimodal in a way that you can on any other platform that we're aware of. You can look at trends over time and find the competitors. So that's a long time effort that we're really happy is finally arrived, and informs our analysis, of course, makes it a little easier for us to dig into the data as well.
Yeah, and it is pretty, I would say, core to discovering a whole lot of companies that come out here from an innovation perspective, and That's
Oh,
been
sure, yeah.
quite
They
an
were
effort.
using it more and more, right?
Yep.
Well, it's all incredible. Well,
Yep.
thank you again, Chetan Kapoor, Mike Coletta, the analyst at Phocuswright, covering the startups in travel. Thank you so much again, and thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.